10-man raiding had its first start in Karazhan back in the Burning Crusade. It was incredibly popular amount of people to bring to a raid, and it made Karazhan very accessible. Later on, they went with a 25-man as a default, and then a Wrath of the Lich King created 10 and 25-man versions of all raids. However, the 25-man mode was always the real version, and 10-man was just kinda playing second fiddle to the actual raiding. In TOC, Blizzard added heroic 10-man modes, which they carried over to ICC, and they were pretty popular. People liked the 10-man version was actually difficult rather than the easy mode. And since Blizzard was adding different difficulties of raids, in Cataclysm they tried something new. They made it so the 10-man heroic and 25-man heroic would drop equal item level gear. The 25-man mode would just drop more of it, and this essentially meant that the 10-man version was legitimate endgame content now, and you could completely ignore the 25-man mode if you wanted, because you can get just as geared as higher player count mode, while also completing difficult bosses. The 25-man version was always thought of as more difficult than the 10-man version, so that's usually the version which would be counted for world first races, but they would still also report on the 10-man heroic first kills as well. At the end of Cataclysm, they added LFR, and in Mists of Pandaria, they added the Flex mode, as well as changing Heroic to Mythic and swapping the names of all the modes around. And at the very end of the expansion with the launch of Warlords of Draenor, Blizzard decided to end 10-man Heroics, now called Mythics, and instead just made the hardest difficulty be 20-man only, but the new normal and heroic modes could now field 10 to 30 players, and the boss encounters would scale based on how many players you had in your raid group. So with all of this changing around of the modes, what they essentially did was just remove 10-man mythics from the game, and then lowered 25-man mythics down to 20. And ever since then, this has kind of been the end of small raid groups being able to complete competitive content. Now, if you want to do cutting-end raids, you have no choice but to get 20 people together in order to get any kind of attempts in. You see, at the end of Mists of Pandaria, people were really taking advantage of just how gimmicky you could do fights with only 10 people. The world first mythic 10-man version of Garrosh was healed by a single holy priest, and in fact a lot of fights were healed with just one healer, because they would min-max their characters in a way where they didn't really need more healers. Generally, 10-man modes were balanced around having 3 of them, but you'd regularly go down to 2 healers on non-healing intensive fights, and healing them with 1 healer was not supposed to be possible, especially not on the end boss of the hardest raid of the current difficulty. So it was really hard for Blizzard to balance the encounters around only 10 people, because of how different so many classes are and what they can bring to a raid. And this was in Mists of Pandaria when classes were the most homogenized they've ever been in the game's history. Although that probably also contributed to them being able to do stuff like only bringing 1 healer or 5 mages as all their DPS. At the BlizzCon panel for Warlords of Draenor, about 1/4 of the questions asked in their Q&As were just to revert the change of 20-man mythic so they could keep doing it with 10 people.
My question goes on to 10-man rating.
So I'm in a 10-man guild that does heroic content on 2 nights a week, and I'm in for some big changes.
Features like normal and heroic mode rating will be available cross-realm. That being said...
Hi, I'm Palthus from Mal'Ganis. Right now there are 7 times as many guilds that have killed Garrosh on 10-man as opposed to 25. Behind every one of those guilds is a unique culture, leadership, and style. By going to a 20-man raid, you're completely changing that. And what are you gonna do to provide content for people that want to raid hardcore as a 10-man, as a small group?
I mean, this is something that we've addressed. The reality is that moving forward, we have to make the decision. Do we want to support multiple different difficulties separately, only at this highest level, or do we want to streamline the system going forward? And our answer is that we have settled on 20-player content. And I completely understand that it is a difficult challenge and it's going to be a difficult adjustment to make, and that many people may be unable to make that adjustment, and that is unfortunate. But there is awesome content waiting for you at the end of the tunnel, and we ask that you bear with us and come with us on that trip, because we think it's going to be awesome when we get there. But I do apologize.
You could also get really slow computers and just play heroic.
But Blizzard just brushed off all their concerns and just told them it's easier for them to balance it around 20 people, so they're just gonna go with this, and it will be better for the long-term health of the game. Here's the thing though, 10-man mythic raiding was infinitely more popular than 25-man. The participation rate in 10-man was so high that it was incredibly common for many servers to not have a single 25-man mythic raid team that would clear the current content before the next patch came out, as even the most dead servers could field a 10-man mythic raid team. And there was lots of competition at that more casual level, where the vast majority of WoW players occupy. So if 10-man raiding was so much more popular than 25-man, why did they decide to go 20-man as a default? Well, it's a combination of balance and encounter design. The 10-man mythic modes were just straight up easier than 25-mans. No one at the top level who competed for world first races took the 10-man race seriously, even if they were reported on rather seriously at the time. Everyone knew that the real race was in the 25-man modes, and that's where they would dedicate most of their time and effort. Although some of the top guilds did take 10-man seriously to an extent, and would do them almost exclusively, with Paragon being one of the most notable, as their guild got a ton of world first kills under their belt, and converted completely to 10-mans in Mist of Pandaria. Although even they admitted that they would rather do 25-man, but they didn't have a roster in order to support that. So they were kind of forced into doing 10-man onlys, and they kind of disbanded once they could no longer do that. Because part of the popularity of the 10-man mode was that it was way easier to get a roster of 10 good people and keep them together than it was to keep a roster of 25. Jeff Bezos is said to have a philosophy where work teams should not be bigger than what could be supported with 2 boxes of pizza at a party. And the average pizza has about 8 slices, which means less than 16 people. He says small groups just work together much better and it's harder to manage bigger ones, which is definitely true when it comes to World of Warcraft raiding as well. Although encounter difficulty was even more ridiculous once you got hyper-competitive players min-maxing every single little thing of a 10-man encounter, which were usually balanced after they did the 25-man modes, since they would usually just scale down encounters rather than design something for 10-man. Except for 1 or 2 fights per raid where they would design those around 10-man exclusively and then scale them up, and they were actually balanced appropriately for World First Raiders. So a lot of people who took 10-man mythic seriously would have really sacky comps, like only running and stacking whatever the best class or utility was during that expansion, like maybe just bringing 5 hunters or 5 mages, and bringing the least amount of healers possible so they can have more DPS. In fact, there were some competitive 10-man teams that tried to bring no healers, and some of those teams actually had some success. That's just the level of craziness people were trying in the 10-man modes, where Blizzard really wants people to bring a mix of everything to a fight. That's why they give a whole bunch of buffs to different classes in order to encourage you to bring a priest for fortitude, a demon hunter for debuffs, a warrior for their shouts, a warlock for their further utility, and etc, etc. And since Blizzard was just designing their fights for the 25-man modes anyway, and then just scaling them down afterwards, it obviously made sense for them to pick 20-man as their new default hardest difficulty, rather than the mode that they balanced around as an afterthought. Because it was just more fun for them to throw everything at the wall because they knew a 20-man roster could realistically bring something that was needed for a particular fight. Like if they absolutely needed a warlock to have gateway in order to avoid the spikes in Painsmith, for example. So because Blizzard was designing them for the 25-mans anyway, and they didn't like how many shenanigans the world's first 10-player mythic groups were getting into, it was kind of a no-brainer for them just to remove that mode and go into 25-man, like they all wanted to design for anyway. And that's pretty much why 10-man raiding died. No one at the competitive level took it seriously, and it was just the fun mode full of jank. However, that doesn't really disregard the fact that 10-man raiding was very popular, since it was mostly popular because it was just easier to do than the 25-man. But that doesn't mean you should throw it out either. If Blizzard were to convert the 20-man mythics today into 10-mans, they would be horribly unbalanced because the game is just not designed around that. But they could attempt to fix a lot of those problems by just removing class-specific buffs. A priest doesn't need to give fortitude, they can just give everyone 5% more health baseline. You don't need a monk or demon hunter to give debuffs to a boss, just lower the boss's health by 10%. The warlock's portals are definitely a lot harder to just fix easily, but so was bloodlust for the longest time. The way they fixed that was just by giving it to other classes and having it on a consumable. If they just made an item that you can place down and it would simulate the portal, well, there you go. Create items which can just simulate the buffs if you really want them to stay in the game, like they used to have anyway before they removed them for some reason. If they really wanted mechanics to require certain classes with immunities, just give more immunities to more characters. I remember in Legion they took away the 90% damage reduction of dispersion from Shadow Priests because they didn't feel like they should have a quasi-immunity while also being able to do lots of damage. If a fight is so easy that you can heal it with one player, maybe they could design the fights around 10 people instead of scaling it down from 20 from the get-go. What I'm trying to say is there are fixes to all the problems that they had, they just don't want to fix them, for the combined reason that they prefer the bigger raid sizes to design around anyway, and also the community of World First Raiders didn't take it seriously. Which really reminds me of Heroes of the Storm, Blizzard's MOBA game which ultimately failed and is now maintenance mode. When it first launched, it was trying to compete with two pre-established very popular MOBAs, and Heroes of the Storm was able to stand out a bit by having incredibly unique characters that just could not exist in the other two games, like Murky, Cho'Gall, or Abathur. Cho'Gall literally requires two players working together in order to control a single character, and Abathur is only slightly stronger than a minion, and basically contributes to the fight by sitting in base all game and just providing buffs, while his slugs slowly push every 15 seconds. And these three characters were incredibly popular in the game and very well loved, so what Blizzard did was just never try anything like this ever again, because they wanted it to become an esport, and these kinds of characters cause problems in competitive environments. After Cho'Gall, I believe, Blizzard only ever released heroes that could compete in the meta without any jank, before putting the game in maintenance mode. They could have easily just made Heroes of the Storm the fun MOBA to play, but I don't think they want that. I think one of the core philosophies of some of the developers there is for their games to have a competitive scene. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that, as Nintendo does the complete opposite with Super Smash Bros. They hate that people take that game seriously and try to make it as casual as possible. It's just on the pendulum scale of where Blizzard leans, I think they would rather if all their games had a competitive scene, and definitely make that a priority as well. And since 10-man raiding is kind of on the scale of casual, it makes sense why they would drop it based on their philosophies. Even if I think they really should not have and should bring it back. In the same way, I wish they would make more creative characters like Cho'Gall or Abathur in Heroes of the Storm. And here's the funny thing about WoW when it comes to catering to the casual player base. They actually stood out in vanilla WoW because they were the only MMO to cater to the casual player. In fact, MMO players at the time thought of WoW as the baby game because it didn't even de-level your player if you died too many times. And current WoW is still incredibly casually friendly. In fact, all of the other difficulties of raids are very friendly towards casual guilds. They just want there to be a hard mode to exist only for the most hardcore players, which is a nice carrot on the stick for people playing the game, as they know they can always just join a mythic guild if they want to do the hardest content, but they don't have to. And if the current system works, and has been the one they've been using for the past 4 expansions, doesn't that mean there's no reason to try to make a 10-man mode mythic now? Personally, I don't think so. For them to implement 10-man mythics, that would require more work on their part to try to make the mode not a cakewalk for competitive players. But currently, mythics are already a cakewalk for competitive players after the first month, as Blizzard regularly nerfs encounters after world firsts are achieved anyway. Take the current Mythic Sylvanas for example. He was incredibly difficult in a finely tuned fight within the first week or two. However, the version that guilds are working on today is just straight up an easier encounter than what existed during that first week, for just a multitude of reasons, including just the availability of gear and buffs to certain classes and specs and equipment that were put out over time. Current mythics are only hard for the first few weeks, then it's kind of a joke to the competitive community. So, if the current version is already a cakewalk to competitive players after only a few weeks, and many non-first world raids have a lot of fun progressing on those fights anyway, even though they're vastly easier than they were in the first 2 weeks, what exactly is wrong with 10-man versions being the exact same? They'll basically be easier than the 20-mans from the get-go, sure, but I'm failing to see how that's exactly a problem. It would require them to balance the game around them again, but just because that's difficult doesn't mean it shouldn't be tried. If Blizzard wants to create fights with knowing they can realistically have one of every spec in there, then they just need to go the bloodless route and just give more options to more classes. I think Blizzard cares about class homogenization more than the players actually do, as how many shamans are really upset that the mage can use bloodlust instead of them? And as a priest main, I don't even like giving powered fortitude to people. I would be 100% fine if they just removed it from the game, or just turned it into ability which wasn't a buff you used once before a fight. So, in conclusion, 10-man mythic raiding is currently not possible at all with the way the game is designed, and would take some real work on the developer's part in order to make it ready. But seeing as Blizzard and the competitive community prefer the bigger raid sizes, this is probably not going to happen, even though 10-man mythics were the more popular version back when they existed for 2 expansions.